really that's what drew me to become a therapist is I thought we have got to address the trauma among this population. What I now know is that the kids involved with child welfare, who are more likely to have the trauma be addressed, are the same kids that are involved with juvenile justice. There's so much overlap. And so that's really what brought me to the field, was wanting to work with kids involved with juvenile justice around trauma. And then when I entered into the field, one of the first things that I discovered is that if I was going to specialize in trauma, I was going to need to specialize in addiction, because the two very often go hand in hand. And so I started working with people around addiction as well. And now primarily work with folks who are kind of at the intersection between the two.
Broaderlands Podcast.
The opinions expressed on Broaderlands Podcast are those of the guest speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host or Broaderlands Podcast.
Summer, welcome to Broaderlands Podcast. What an honor to have you on.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
Yeah, before we get started, maybe we can share learning a little bit about you and how you decided to become a trauma and addiction counselor.
Sure. Okay, so my name is Summer Krause, and I am a therapist and an addiction counselor based out of Portland, Oregon. And really what brought me to this work was juvie. So juvenile detention centers. I started out with a desire to go actually into ministry. I was not raised in the church, but I became a Christian when I was 15, and that kind of changed the trajectory of my life. And so when I was in college, I started volunteering in juvenile detention centers as a volunteer chaplain. And as I was doing that, I just fell in love with that work. I just have a real heart for that population, and continued it in Portland when I came back to the Portland area. And really what I saw is just case after case of just the most horrendous stories of trauma among these kids. And they are kids, and so working with them, it felt like every other kid that I met had had one or both parents die. And if their parents hadn't been deceased, they were incarcerated, and they had experienced so much abuse, and not just abuse, but some of the most, violent and extreme forms of child abuse. And so I saw all these wounded kids that I really enjoyed, and then seeing them in a context where they were sort of treated with, a lens as if they were adult offenders. And there were, these punitive kinds of measures in this system with, seclusion and restraint and all the things. And so really that's what drew me to become a therapist is I thought we have got to address the trauma among this population. What I now know is that the kids involved with child welfare, who are more likely to have the trauma be addressed, are the same kids that are involved with juvenile justice. There's so much overlap. And so that's really what brought me to the field, was wanting to work with kids involved with juvenile justice around trauma. And then when I entered into the field, one of the first things that I discovered is that if I was going to specialize in trauma, I was going to need to specialize in addiction, because the two very often go hand in hand. And so I started working with people around addiction as well. And now primarily work with folks who are kind of at the intersection between the two.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all your work. And I'm excited for this episode because I want to learn more about you and more about trauma and addiction connection, coming from that background myself. So I look forward to this episode. And before we get started with some more deeper questions about that, I would love to ask you about how were you first introduced to Dr. Najavits' work, and maybe you can share a little bit of insights of the Seeking Safety and her other recovery models, if you don't mind.
Sure. So Dr. Najavits, Lisa Najavits, she's on the East Coast and has really dedicated her entire life into working with people around trauma and addiction. And I was introduced to Seeking Safety, her most popular model, when I was working in a residential treatment program for youth. All of the kids in our program were in state custody. They were all on probation or parole. all had issues with mental health and substance abuse and criminal behavior. Most of them were gang involved. And someone sort of knowing what had drawn me to the field, they said, have you heard about Seeking Safety? And it hadn't been out all that long, but it was originally developed for adults, has since been used with adolescents as well. But it sounded like a perfect fit for what I really wanted to do within our program. And so I went onto the website, I went onto seekingsafety.org and looked for a training that was coming up. And the next one was coming up in Canada. But this is all before I had children. So I had the luxury of just asking my husband if he was up for a road trip. And we drove to Canada to hear Dr. Najavits give a presentation. And really, when I learned about Seeking Safety, I fell in love with the model. And I knew it was the piece that was missing in a lot of our programming, really looking at substance abuse and trauma and how those two things go together. So I came back and I started implementing Seeking Safety groups, using it as part of my individual therapy sessions as well. And of course, I was working in an environment with like an already difficult to serve population. Really, I don't know if there was anything worse that my adolescent clients at that time could think of than the thought of coming to a group where we talk about the worst moments of their life when they felt most vulnerable, right? And to do that in front of their peers, they had a lot of fears about this. And so I had to reassure them that this is not a model where we're going to sit around in a group and you're going to, feel exposed in front of your peers. That definitely especially for our gang involved youth, that was a no-go. So I had to reassure them, nope, this is about focusing on everyone here has had bad stuff happen. This is going to not be asking you to relive it and go back and tell the story. We're going to learn how to cope with the ways that impacts your life today. And I did get some buy-in around that idea. And so started running these groups. But of course, with adolescents, like they tend to have this higher need to be entertained. And so I would try different things to draw them into the process and ended up contacting the author and just sharing with her some of what I was doing and, asked some questions. And then she and I started working together. So I became a trainer in the model and started consulting with different organizations, starting out with, adolescent programs in terms of how to use the model with youth. And now I've been doing that for a very long time as a trainer, as an author. Over the course of my time working with her, she wrote Finding Your Best Self, which I see on your back bookshelf there. Finding Your Best Self came out before the pandemic, and I had a chance to review it when it was in its development and actually teach the very first training on it. Started using that as part of groups. I'm part of a group counseling practice in Portland. So started doing groups for some of my adult clients using that one. And then just at the end of last year, she came out with another book, Creating Change, which also had an opportunity to review in its development and now getting to integrate that into my work as well. So I love her work and I find the concepts just to not only have had the greatest impact on my, in my career, but also like personally, I mean, so many of the concepts that she talks about within these books and models, like have been really meaningful to me. I try to live and breathe them in my life and put them into practice as well.
I love that. Thank you. Sharing a little personal story about me. I came from that background, that environment. So I totally understand. So I appreciate you with all your work you do. I remember I was in Ohio one day and I watched a movie. It was about Tupac Shakur and he died, he got murdered, and he came from a lot of trauma as well. And I watched this movie, and at the end, he gets murdered, and I started crying, and I wasn't sobbing, but for 3.5 hours, I had tears coming down my eyes, and I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what was going on, and but it was they were literally coming down slow down my eyes, and I couldn't stop it, and I realized it was a lot of pain that was trapped inside of me. And I felt this healing because I had this deep sense of awareness that we just didn't know any better.
Yes.
And it felt like someone popped that balloon of trapped energy or whatever you want to call it inside of me. And I felt healing take place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know about your experience with the Tupac movie, but There is something when we are able to hear another person's story of suffering or just their experience that, like, of course, we didn't walk in their exact same shoes, but like it connects with something within you. And I do think there can be healing from just that shared narrative or knowing that, I'm not alone. And when we see other people's paths to healing as well, sometimes that opens up possibilities that we didn't even know were there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because I remember thinking like he wasn't the only one that died. I had so many friends that got shot, murdered from just all, traumatized people, and just didn't know any better.
Yes.
I know I joined a gang not to be a bad person, but to feel loved, to want to be a part of, and feel like a somebody. Because deep down inside, I felt like a nobody.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And isn't that such an important message for the world, here on the podcast that, I don't know anybody who's joined a gang to be a bad person, that people seek out some of these avenues because maybe it's the first place they felt like they belong. Maybe it's like when you feel like the world is a really dangerous place, which, it can be. And if you've experienced a lot of trauma, trying to have a sense of protection, right, is like what draws us into behaviors that can ultimately put us in greater danger, right? The pursuit was never malicious. It was trying to find a way to survive.
Yeah, thank you. How would you define trauma, and what are some of the most common misconceptions of trauma that you hear often with people?
Yeah. It's such a good question. And I actually ask this when I teach trainings, as I say, okay, so let's just talk a little bit about what is trauma. Because usually when I'm working with behavioral health providers, like they've been to trauma trainings before, right? It's not a new concept to them. And really what we see, just there's a public awareness of trauma these days in a way that there wasn't in the past. And yet, if you ask Google and you ask Siri, right, you ask Alexa, what is trauma? You get different answers. And I get different answers from helpers as well. And sometimes they're quoting different, gurus in the field. And what it seems like is as soon as one person puts a definition out there, someone else goes, yeah, and it also can be. And then there's also this piece. And then, but what if, right? And there's like all these different layers in terms of what trauma is. And it comes in so many different forms where for some people, it's like an isolated event of trauma, like a car accident or a sexual assault or something. And then for other people, it's like, yeah, it's in the water, right? I mean, it's so many doses of the stuff that it's hard to even tease out an isolated, experience or event. So I like to use basically the origin of the word trauma, which is wound, that it's a wound. And we know that there are many different kinds of wounds and that there are many wounds that don't bleed, right? But they have that lingering effect into our lives today.
Yeah, thank you. That's how I love to see it as well, as wound. I come from the 12-step community, and in step 2, it's came to believe in a power greater than yourself that can restore you to sanity. Well, if you look at the root for sanity, that means healthy. And when you put it insanity, that means not healthy. It doesn't mean I'm a crazy person, but what's this unhealthiness inside of me? The thoughts, the belief systems, the low self-esteem, not feeling good enough, the voice, that narrative, that negative narrative that's creating a lot of unhealthiness in my life. So when I look at it like that, it was just so much easier to approach.
Right. Yes. And it makes so much sense that, when you don't have a concept of what's, like a language for talking about what's going on, that people do oftentimes try to put the pieces together in ways that can be so harmful. Like I'm crazy, there's something just wrong with me. I had one adolescent, when I was talking about what trauma is and how, PTSD can manifest, she said, oh, I just always thought I was a bad kid. Right. And so when we are able to sort of understand maybe some of our behaviors or struggles in light of the wounding, right, it opens up possibilities. And your second part of your question was, what are some of the misconceptions? And I'll tell you, one of the most common misconceptions that I hear as a therapist is that people don't recover from it. So people come in having believed I'm crazy, I'm lazy, I'm bad, I'm weak. And then also some of the folks that I see, they have been working at this stuff for years. They've seen multiple providers, and they've never heard that people recover from trauma or that they recover
Wow.
from PTSD, and people do. Now, that doesn't look like Men in Black where they have those little wands, right? They're just like, remove it from your memory, if only. But actually, I think there's a lot of strengths that grow out of having lived through these experiences. But, you won't forget it. But people do recover and don't have to suffer in the way that they have when it's been unaddressed.
Thank you for that. One of the bad words in the 12-step community, because I've been sober since 2009, so I've been around in different parts of the country, different meetings, spoke a lot of places and around the country. And so, I like to observe, and a bad word is addiction in the 12-step AA community, because, there's alcoholic and there's the addict. But in the 12-step big book, the AA big book, there's a line where it says, alcohol became my master. And I love the root meaning for addiction, addictus, which has something with being a slave to this substance and this behavior. At least that's how I look at it. And I was a slave to this substance and this behavior in this state of being that I was stuck in for a very long time. I was a prisoner of my own mind and body. How would you describe addiction?
Yeah, addiction. Now, I work with adolescents and adults. So one thing I'll say is that adolescents will also almost never identify with the idea of addiction. So even when I'm working with youth who are using substances, very rarely will they kind of identify with like, I'm an alcoholic, I'm addicted or I'm dependent. The idea of like hitting rock bottom, I've yet to meet a 15-year-old who's like, well, I've lost everything. That just doesn't tend to be the case. It's still kind of working for them. And Dr. Najavits, in her book, Finding Your Best Self, she has basically an addictive behavior scale, but she calls it the excessive behavior scale. And part of that is to keep people's kind of heckles down in terms of like getting defensive of like, I'm not addicted, right? Is behaviors that can be too much, right? I mean, when I think of addiction at its core, I think of the inability to stop. Right? Despite your best efforts, despite a desire and intention and understanding that it would be better for me and my family and my situation if I stopped, is even when you attempt to do so, you're unable to do it on your own. Now, certainly there are people who have been able to, quote unquote, beat addiction, on their own sort of natural recovery. But for many people, it requires effort outside of themselves.
Yeah, thank you. She has a section in Finding Your Best Self about how trauma and addiction go hand in hand. And she says they're brother and sister maladies. I've heard Gabor Mate, who's famous, and he says, not everyone that has trauma is an addict, but everyone is an addict has some form of trauma. How do you connect the two?
Yeah. So, I mean, that relationship, like I said, when I came in, I thought, I want to work with people around trauma, and quickly learned, yep, I'm going to have to work with people around addiction because they are, kind of cousins here, brother and sister, as she said. And I think part of that is because the number one co-occurring disorder with PTSD, meaning people who have PTSD don't just have that, but they have something else going on. The number one is a substance use disorder. And for most people who have both disorders, it was the PTSD that came first. And then the substance abuse followed as a way of self-medication. Now, certainly for some, it was the substance use disorder that came first, which also increases people's vulnerability to trauma or further trauma. So sometimes, the PTSD comes second in those cases. Either one increases the likelihood of the other one coming into play as well. And they feed off of each other. And that's a really tragic part in working with people around trauma and addiction, is that, maybe the person experiences trauma and they start drinking as a way to cope with some of the symptoms and the pain. And then that increases their vulnerability and they experience further trauma, maybe in the course of, their addiction. And so then there's further trauma that happens. So they start moving on to maybe harder substances, and on it goes. And we see them just feed off of each other into really tragic stories. And, many of those end in death, and sadly. So there's that piece. And for some people, you almost can't tell which one came first. You can't talk about one issue without talking about the other issue, because they were just interconnected from the jump. That, they may have been trafficked and substances were given to them as a way of subduing them. People growing up in homes where people use substances, they also hurt one another, where, to be able to see someone and say, I only want to work on the addiction, or I only want to work on the trauma, but, I don't want to work on the other stuff. It's like, you can't work on one without the other, because they were so intertwined from the beginning.
Wow. Thank you. If someone's they're struggling from addiction and they harbor deep resentments, is that a sign of hidden trauma?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I'll tell you that within this idea of trauma-informed care, and when I say trauma-informed care, I don't just mean like within behavioral health services. Certainly, trauma-informed care is important there. But, I've been to trauma-informed dentists. I have a trauma-informed tattoo artist, right? Like, there are trauma-informed prisons, trauma-informed school systems, right? But really the idea of that is that whatever the environment is sort of using trauma as a lens for understanding some of the suffering, some of the behaviors, understanding mental health and addiction, and assuming across the board that it's at play. Even when you don't know, right? Like you said, maybe it's hidden trauma for the person. They're not even aware of their own, trauma and how that may manifest into their lives now. But also as helpers and people trying to help people heal, we, as a therapist, we have intake paperwork, right? Some people will never check off any of the boxes indicating their history of trauma, and yet it is there. And so if I only assume that trauma is at play for people who are able to come in and sort of spell it out, here's my story, beginning, middle, and end. I have trauma. This is how it shows up in my life. I'm going to miss a lot of people that it is going on, but it may not be in their awareness screen, or it may be something they're aware of, but is too threatening to think about addressing. So within that framework, I would say, let's assume that it's there when people are struggling with addiction. And certainly when we see like those deep resentments, I think of one study where they discovered that the number one symptom that people who have post-traumatic stress disorder, that they report being troubled by the most, is anger. That anger is so often a part of, the process when it comes to trauma as well as addiction. And that there can be this, this feel something is not right, and I'm pissed off about it, right? That is sort of the theme song of anger, is it is the emotion. We all have it as humans, but the theme song of anger is something is not right. There is a violation here, and we kind of have a natural longing for things to be made right, for there to be justice, for there to be, ownership. Right? Apology. Like, we have a desire for that. And so it makes sense when trauma is at play that people may not be able to sort of move beyond some of the anger and the resentment because they have been wronged legitimately. And a lot of times are fearful that if I let go of the anger, does that mean the person just got to do this unspeakable evil and they never have to take responsibility for it? Or if I let go of the anger, does it discount the significance of what happened? And so I think being able to listen to the message behind the anger, listen to the message behind the resentment, can give us some clues in terms of what's fueling it, but also how to channel the anger in a way that can really help us to heal and move forward, right? Rather than having it be something that festers into the seething bitterness that can ruin people's quality of life, can ruin relationships, can keep people stuck in the addiction as well. So tending to it, knowing that it's there, suspecting that it might be rooted in trauma, but also finding ways to work at it that ultimately can be safe for the person and others.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you bringing up the anger because I was such an angry person. I was such a violent drunk.
Mm.
I asked that about the wound because you know how trauma means wound. And if resentment is refilling, what are we feeling? Happiness, or are we feeling this inner wound that never healed? So when you put pressure or stress on it, it hurts still because it's not fully healed. So,
Right.
I come from the 12-step community. I love the 12-step community, but I do challenge it to continue to grow. And trauma could be a bad word. So I ask that question because are we feeling some form of trauma, some inner wound that we're touching when we put pressure or stress? A lot of people relapse when they get caught up with stress and pressure. So,
That's right.
and I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of so much hurt and pain inside of me. So talking about it and just, I heard a quote one time saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison, wishing for that other person to die. It only kills you. And when I heard that, I guess my heart was so open to new information. It helped transform me in a weird way.
Yeah.
Just a saying, a beautiful saying, if you're fully open, your heart, it can help transform you. And it really did. It really drew awareness and it got me to start questioning stuff. I went back into my early life and seeing how certain things affected me and fogged up my window of perception and affected my brain development.
Yeah. And my guess is that you had very good reasons to feel angry, and that when it drew your attention and to think about, like, what's the price tag of holding it in the way that I am, right? That, it's toxic to me, but that the anger itself wasn't something that was wrong about you. It was probably there for very good reason.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. In Lisa's book, Finding Your Best Self, she talks about language. And I always say when I came into the 12-step rooms, I didn't speak English. My first language was not English or Spanish. It was victimese. And I was a victim to everything.
Uh-huh.
I'm blaming everyone else. And I think it's important to acknowledge certain things. And I may have been a victim to certain circumstances, but don't get stuck in victimhood because that kept me trapped in a lower vibration or frequency. And I couldn't get out of it for a very long time.
Yes. I totally appreciate what you bring. And ultimately, the victimese language that you were speaking, I mean, it disempowers us, is the thing about it, is when you have been genuinely victimized, but then you kind of continue to live out of this framework that the world is a giant bully that's doing things to me and I have no ability to make it stop, or even if I try, I'll fail. And if I reach out, no one will help me. Like, you start giving away the power that maybe legitimately there were things that were out of your control taken from you. But then now we stay in this loop that, it keeps us stuck.
Mm. There's a spiritual teacher, Wayne Dyer, that once said, a hostile person lives in a hostile world. A loving person lives in a loving world, same world.
Mm.
And I had to learn how to have understanding and compassion for myself. And especially, what's that Jesuit priest saying? Give me your child for the first several years and I'll tell you the person they'll become.
Mm.
And looking back into my first several years, it really helped me. I never questioned my life. I never tried to look at it from a different point of view. And when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And it really helped me a lot.
Yeah.
Just having
Yeah.
understanding. Yeah.
Information is power. And like those quotes that you were just sharing, I love quotes too. One of the things I like about Seeking Safety, actually all of Dr. Najavits' models, they all start with a quote. And it's actually a part of the process of how we conduct the treatment, is that we start by just reading the quote and saying, what's the main point? And kind of, engaging around it, because there is something about like those nuggets of wisdom or like a different perspective or something that grounds us in like love as the path forward, that it can open up possibilities for us. I think we live in a world where we're used to just these little sound bites and, social media, but they can grab you, and really what can come from that is tremendous.
I totally agree. They talk about the gift of desperation. I was so desperate. My heart was so open for new information. Even that scripture, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. I look back at my life, I'm playing all this negative rap music that's talking about all this negative stuff to do. And I'm that's my mental diet. That's what I'm feeding my mind, body, and soul.
Yeah.
Since, of course I'm going to have that reality because my personality creates my personal reality.
Yeah.
So I started to become more aware of that. That started to change, watching how I speak to myself, that voice in the head, all that stuff. I guess my next question is, how does different forms of trauma impact a person's recovery? Have you noticed there's no black and white set of approach?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no one path to recovery. And certainly the types of trauma do impact the path forward because, when I think about all the different types of trauma among folks that I see, some of the deepest wounding it's not the quote unquote trauma itself, it's others' responses to the trauma, or if it was done interpersonally, like the nature of the relationship with the person who did the harm, right? So if the people who you trust the most are the people who hurt you the worst, it adds another layer to recovery, right? In terms of like the betrayal that comes with that, versus, someone where it still can be, difficult, the recovery and the impact of it. But, if it's an act of nature or something, right? There's sort of a different flavor to it. Or actually, John Breer, he's an adolescent trauma guru, he says, two people can have a trauma where, they go headfirst down a staircase, but it makes a difference if you slipped and fell or if you were pushed, right? And so that piece of like the nature of the trauma and also the dosage of trauma, right? For, again, sort of what we call simple PTSD, where there's, an event of trauma versus complex, where there's been multiple traumas over the course of the lifetime, or like in case of childhood abuse, where it's ongoing traumas. And sadly, sometimes when I'm working with young people, it's not over, right? I mean, we're shoveling snow while the blizzard is still coming. And we see that ongoing trauma that, of course, impacts. Because if I think about the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, post means after, right? So PTSD is talking about the trauma has happened and it's over. And now we're dealing with the symptoms that, occur after. But sadly, many times it's not. And in cases of interpersonal violence, it's going on. And so all of those things impact the path. But even if we were to somehow be able to have, two people had the exact same trauma, their path to recovery can look different because everybody is unique. And what, the ways that they made sense out of their experience can be different. And so that influences the recovery process. My in-laws actually had a boating accident where their boat capsized in the middle of the ocean. They couldn't see land. I mean, they didn't have time to get the life jacket on. They just had time to grab them and sort of hang on. And so for them, they had this miraculous rescue. And our Oregonian is our newspaper. And so the Oregonian had this write-up about this, pretty amazing rescue. So they've both been through the exact same traumatic experience. And when they quoted my father-in-law, he said, "I knew help would come. I just didn't know how long it would be." And my mother-in-law's quote was, "I knew we were going to die." Right. And so they're in the exact same situation, but they're having two different narratives in their mind, which of course impacted the effect of the experience that they'd had. So yeah, types of trauma matters in both cases. People recover and heal, but a lot of times it's about, trying different things and discovering what works for you. And if one way doesn't work, try something else.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I learned that in my own 12-step journey. When it comes to sponsorship, people come from all different walks in life and backgrounds, religious beliefs, different upbringings. So I learned to pray and ask God for help to get some intuition to approach this person a certain way, because I was taught a black and white way of sponsoring someone. And if they're not doing it the way we're doing it, they're not ready, and kind of like push them off. And the next thing you know, they're gone. And for a period of time, I didn't talk to them or nothing, like they were contagious or something, but it was just learned behavior that I had to learn how to let go of and become more aware of how to help people and speak their language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Life requires flexibility, and certainly relationships do too.
I had one question with the, in the 12-step community, they talk about a spiritual malady. I don't even know if you use that term or whatever, but Dr. Peter Levine describes trauma as, in short, as a disconnection of self. How do you see those concepts in relating to like each other, or do you connect with them at all with your own experience and work?
Yeah. Well, and to me, there's sort of a theme to both of them, right? So if we're thinking about this void that we're trying to fill within us, right? That there's a need, that there's a longing to fill that void, and that, sort of the ultimate cure, if you will, is, a connection with a higher power, something greater than yourself, rather than trying to fill what some people call like the God-sized box, right, within us. And then Peter Levine, with all of his work around somatic experiencing, the connection with the body when it comes to trauma, looking at this disconnect from self. To me, the central theme here is that connection, right? And actually, there's a saying in the addiction field that the opposite of addiction is connection. Johan, what's his name? Hari is his last name. He wrote Chasing the Scream. And so this idea that, the opposite of addiction is connection, and that we as human beings are wired for connection, and that things go awry when we're disconnected from ourselves, when we unplug, we just start going through the motions, and, we're not aware of, our internal emotional lives, sometimes even hunger and thirst, the impact of trauma. People can become very disconnected from themselves, but then disconnected from others, relationships, isolating, pulling away. No one can be trusted, holding up. And then the disconnection from God as well, or higher power. But, I would say, God from my worldview. And so that longing, right? And that true health happens when we're connected with ourselves, we're connected with others, and we're connected to God. And when we're disconnected in any of those areas, that can present in ways that are troubling. And also, I'll say the disconnect is very often rooted in trauma as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I love how you brought that up, because Carl Jung said something profound, and he said it's a low-level thirst for wholeness, or in medieval terms, union for God. And if you look at yoga, it means to unite with God, or you look at religion, it means to reconnect, rebind.
Yes.
And if you look at recovery, it means to get back.
I love it.
Yeah, appreciate that. I think that all goes together perfectly. You talk about safe coping skills.
Yeah.
And I know for me, like I was taught the spiritual principles, and those were my safe coping skills, along with learning how to have a group of people to talk to, and learning how to live one day at a time. And when I started to do that, along with applying principles, trying to stay in the present moment, I learned how to retrain my mind and body, for the most part, to be in the present moment, where what I like to say, God lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. So the safe coping skills, which are in Seeking Safety, they're actually in Finding Your Best Self as well. And then now in Creating Change, she has a whole new list of skills as well, a completely fresh set. There's 84 of them in Seeking Safety, and really it's just a menu of options, right? It's not the end all be all of safe coping, but it's a really lovely list of looking at all of these different examples of how to cope with emotional pain, but that are safe, rather than sort of moving toward unsafe ways of coping, like engaging in substance misuse, or, excessive behaviors, whether it's gambling or risky sex or self-harm or aggression, overeating, undereating. We see lots of different ways that people try to cope with emotional pain that ultimately doesn't help them heal. And so the safe coping skills are really about, like, if we're going to take something away, right? So if we're going to work with people around decreasing or stopping their substance use, as an example, we have to replace that with something to how to cope with life and the stressors that come with it. The very same thing we may have, in our mission statement as an organization, or, maybe it's on your podcast description of what you want to help people with in terms of a problem with addiction. it can be the exact same thing that for people they view to be the solution. I say it's the best thing I found so far in terms of just how to make it. So honoring that people are trying to cope the best way they know how, but it becomes really important to empower people with tools in terms of how to replace the unsafe behaviors with safe coping.
Yeah, thank you. I spoke a couple years ago at a big conference. It was about like 1,600 people, right? And I shared with the co-founder of AA, and he talked about the agonizing experience he had when his mother told him and his sister how his father left him. And he had this wound and he didn't talk to anybody about it. And I said, well, trauma means wound. And he had a lot of abandonment issues, double abandonment issues when his mother left him as well to go to college back in the early 1900s. That was rare, right? And he had to live with his grandparents. And then she eventually got her sister to live with her, and he stayed with his grandparents. So he felt abandoned, along with his childhood sweetheart dying. And the school principal made that announcement. He had a lot of hurt and pain and trauma, early childhood trauma, Bill Wilson. And I related to his story because I came from that background. And I still, to this day, I could feel these abandonment issues that I have still affect me to this day. It's hard for me to let people in. And because if I let them in and really get close to them, they're going to leave me. And it's really painful. And the spiritual teacher, Eckhart Tolle, says at the beginning of all addiction, there is a pain. And at the end of all addiction, there is pain. And that's my truth through my experience. But there's something that I heard in Lisa's book, Finding Your Best Self. She talked about social pain, which I never really gave much. I haven't been aware of that term before.
Yeah.
But and she mentions that pain, physical pain and social pain, is there similarity between the two?
Yeah. Both of them create tremendous ache. Social pain is, maybe related to some of what you were talking about with Bill W. and your own story as well. But it's that pain that I would say it's like the intangible part of wound that comes from experiences with like betrayal and abandonment, discrimination, racism, right? There's all these different kinds of pain that come in relationship with other. One definition that I like when it comes to social pain is the hidden trauma of otherness, being othered, pushed aside. And, in some cases that you're not valuable or you're less than or being mistreated, that longing, that we have for justice, for things to be made right. And when it's not, right, it's unfounded, right? There's a whole set of wounds that come from that. So if we think about like healing comes with connection, but wounding comes from these experiences of social pain and othering, right? It makes sense that the very antidote of being able to find safe people who are there for you and are trustworthy and that you can, open up your heart and experiences to, and they don't mock and they don't leave and they don't criticize, is that it makes it very hard to do that. Because when you've had experiences in relationships where it's not been that way, then, we want to pull away and believe that everybody is untrustworthy and everybody will leave.
Well, I found myself really sensitive with rejection. Sharing differently in the 12-step community, and you're not sharing exactly like the group think, can be hurtful for someone like me. And it's been my experience where you're not wanted anymore. You're being talked about behind your back, or someone put a sticker, I am an alcoholic, because I don't like to say I'm an alcoholic in a 12-step meeting. I like to say I'm a grateful member because I feel that's healthier for me. But in the groupthink terms, I'm trying to be different. Or if I'm sharing information, well, Summer said, or Lisa said, or Gabor said, that's bringing in new information, and that's kind of a no-no to some people. And you're not sticking to the script. So that's been really hard for me in the 12-step community, is being authentic and sharing the way I want to share versus the groupthink setting.
Yeah,
that's
right.
been a challenge.
And the culture, 12 steps in a lot of ways, I feel like the 12-step program, they have the secret sauce, there is just some really good stuff that comes out of 12 steps, and it has changed so many people's lives. And yet within these 12-step communities, right, there's like a culture that develops that sometimes isn't even a part of the model. Like it's been kind of infused through the perspective of influencers within that particular meeting, or there can be rigidity that really takes away from being able to hear people or have them define things in their own ways, come as they are, meet them where they're at, sponsor them in a way that it works for them. And so sometimes it can become a toxic environment, just like we see in other spiritual communities, right? Like there's some really great, healthy spiritual communities where everyone's welcome and people can connect with each other and connect with God. And then we see, other spiritual communities within the same religion, right, that are very toxic and people are othered and they're, there's a list of criteria you got to check at the door in order to be welcome, right? Otherwise you are other. And so, I think finding like within 12-step communities or communities where you feel like I can show up as I am, I can take the wisdom that's being offered, but also decide what am I going to adopt as my own, and, getting to live your own recovery journey there too.
Yeah, thank you. And you yourself has put together a faith-based guide to seeking safety. I'd love for you to touch on that for us.
Sure. Yeah. So my friend and colleague, we wrote a supplement to Seeking Safety, which is called the Christian Faith-Based Guide. So it's not a standalone model, but it's used in conjunction with Seeking Safety. Seeking Safety in Dr. Najavits' work is, it's completely secular. There isn't anything overtly spiritual about it, although there is a focus throughout these models on trying to rebuild hope, which is unfortunately one of the first things to go with trauma and addiction, is that sense of hope for the future, basic optimism that gets lost. And so we created this supplemental guide for the model to be able to be used in churches or other faith-based settings that also incorporates, specifically in this case, Christian faith into the work. Risa Hobson is the person who co-authored that. She actually is doing missions work in Portugal right now, working primarily with traumatized people coming off of the mission field, who are in the throes of working with people, in the midst of natural disaster and genocide and extreme poverty and becoming traumatized themselves as a part of trying to help others. So she has a center helping people do that. At any rate, we wrote this faith-based guide because, a lot of people, the persons of faith, rural communities, when they experience trauma or when they're struggling with addiction, they may not call up the local therapist, go to rehab. They go to church and they reach out to their spiritual leaders for help. And sometimes within faith communities, they don't have the tools in terms of walking through the deep and complex, murky water of things like rape and interpersonal violence and child abuse, right? So we wanted to kind of empower some of these other communities with some trauma resources to help people really at whatever door they walk through. And so that's what the Christian faith-based guide is. We took 12 of the topics and created supplemental resources with, scriptures and quotations and application to Christian faith, addressing also religious trauma. So many people have experienced things done to them in the name of God, right? Or within spiritual communities or people that they look up to, spiritual leaders. So we wanted to address that as well. And some of the pieces, like we talked about anger, which is, a human experience, but also often a big part of recovery from trauma and addiction. So looking not only at anger toward other people, anger toward yourself, but also at anger at God, because there is often this kind of spiritual wound that accompanies these experiences. So that's what the faith-based guide is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. There's a saying by Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, and he says, "What you find what is within you, what you find will save you. What you do not find what is within you, what you do not find will destroy you." And that reminds me of the fourth step. And you guys have a term that you use, Lisa put in her book, every child is a detective. Yeah. And I love that because I became a detective, inner detective within myself. And I started to investigate and look into my family without even knowing about this terminology or these teachings that you guys have. And So I really appreciated looking into the family story, investigating these patterns and what happened to my mother and father, just questioning without even getting answers, just making healthy assumptions, just understanding how stuff affected me, gave me understanding of them, and they gave me a lot more compassion for them. I think there's a Zen master who wrote The Living Christ, The Living Buddha. His name was Thich Nhat Hanh, who was good friends with Martin Luther King, but his name was Thich Nhat Hanh, and he said, understanding is love's other name. So when I started to have understanding, I could love my parents. That resentment, that deep resentments and stuff started to dissolve the more and more I could understand how traumatized people, or hurt people.
Yeah. There's a book called It Didn't Start With You, or It Didn't Begin With You, one or the other. But, that idea that, these intergenerational patterns. And so often when trauma and addiction is carried from generation to generation, really what's been passed down is how to survive, right? Is trying to pass on to the next generation how to just survive. And some of the very same things that may have created harm were efforts to try to help a person to survive. And when someone is able to do the work that you're describing, and I know you're trying to support others in doing through your podcast and other work, is it gives the opportunity to heal and then pass on to something different to the next generation as well. There may be really wonderful things from the generations that you want to keep, and you say, yeah, I adopt this as my own and I want to pass that on to my kids or, other people I have influence over. And then there's other things that you say, upon further inspection, right? I think this was coming from a place of woundedness in my parents, or that it made sense in light of X, Y, or Z that some of these things have happened, but I want to do something different, right? And I'm going to sort of modify that belief or that practice in a way that can create healing and safety for the future generations. And I'll say what we won't do for ourselves, we will do for our kids. So that could actually be, breaking cycles can be such a huge motivation for people to do the work themselves.
I appreciate that. Breaking cycles. When I first started saying I love you, my family response was like Scooby-Doo. They didn't know how to respond to that. And talking about emotions, and I'm starting to break the cycle by questioning and looking into stuff and healing my own self. And when I can heal myself, I can start create healing for my family as well and break those cycles. So I appreciate you saying that, especially with that culture of silence. I have a family that doesn't talk about real life issues like traumatic events. They just like turn the other cheek and go, that's not what Jesus meant.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But yeah, I'm starting to do that with my family, and I think it's making a difference little by little. It's a slow process. Yeah. My next question really quick is, what is EMDR?
Oh, yeah, EMDR. So it's eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, which is another trauma model. I use EMDR as well. It's a fantastic model. What we see in general within my field is lots of great models that are out there for treating trauma and PTSD. And we have lots of great models that are out there for treating substance use disorders, addiction, right? Seeking Safety and Creating Change, Finding Your Best Self really was designed to focus on the intersection between the two, because very often what people who have both issues, trauma and addiction, is they get bounced back and forth from services. So they may go to an EMDR provider because they recognize, my gosh, I've been through a lot in my life. I can't sleep. I'm haunted by the memories, that pop into my mind, even when I don't want them to, of the, terrible things that I've seen or have experienced. And so they go see a trauma therapist to work at that. And they may be told, yes, I do that and I can help you with trauma. However, you're using drugs, right? Or you're drinking excessively. And so you're really going to need to work with someone around that before we can do this trauma work. So they get referred over to the substance abuse program, and they walk in through those doors and they say, hey, I'm here because I need to become substance free. And the person says, right, we do that here. We help people with addiction. And also I notice you have a lot of trauma, right? You've got some significant mental health stuff going up, and that may be a barrier for you in terms of recovery. So they get referred back through the same very doors that they came through in the first place. And so this dynamic, I mean, we are evolving and growing in our field in terms of this idea of integrated care, but historically people would get referred or they'd try to be working on one issue without addressing the other because people often have specialization in one or the other. And so EMDR is a great example of a very effective, actually the most researched treatment for PTSD that's out there, but it is a model to focus on the trauma side of recovery and often is not used for people with active addiction because it is past focused in nature, where we are going back and revisiting those painful memories from the past in detail. So obviously, if people are coping with substances, sometimes that can spiral out of control and can interfere with the process. So that's what EMDR is. It involves basically what we call bilateral stimulation. And that's basically stimulating both sides of the brain to help the brain, which traditionally was done through eye movement, looking back and forth. It's done lots of different ways now through tapping or, clicking sounds, other ways to accomplish that end goal. But by stimulating both sides of the brain while pulling up a traumatic memory, it helps to process it so that it can kind of find its place on the timeline of your life versus having it be something that's almost like a file that never got put in the file cabinet. It's always on your desk and you just keep bumping into it and it just keeps popping into your mind and experience.
Well, I'm going to have to look into that. Thank you.
Sure.
I appreciate it. Do you have to tell your full story to heal from trauma? Because a lot of times in the 12-step community, I mean, sponsorship's awesome, but it can also be dangerous if we're not trauma informed. Yeah. And a lot of people go out when they get into the 4th-step, taking a fearless inventory of themselves, or in the 9th-step area where they have to make an amends. And if they've been molested or raped or whatever, brutally tortured as a young child, how is someone that's not trauma informed going to have them make an amends to this person?
Right.
So
yes, that's right. There can be some real misconceptions that even through good intention of helping people to recover, right? I mean, 12 steps is designed for the addiction side of things. It was never designed or, doesn't help to be there to recover from trauma. And so sometimes that can be very re-traumatizing for people, triggering. In terms of, your question was, do people have to share their stories? No. And I would say that is also one of the most common misnomers when it comes to recovery from trauma, is that people believe or have been told that the only way to heal is that you have to go back, relive the trauma, tell the story. And sometimes there's a framework of thinking of that when people don't want to do it, right? That it is avoidance, right? That it's coming from some kind of sickness. And I think actually what that is for a lot of people is an automatic braking system, that they may have an intuitive awareness and knowing, I don't have the coping tools in place to manage what that can bring up. And they may be right. The braking system is there for a reason, because if they're actively using or they haven't replaced it with safe ways to cope, to be able to deal with what that brings up, there's a common dynamic where people will spill and flood. They try to do it, right? Like they've been told, if you just tell your story, if you just expunge it like it's a poison in your body, you'll feel better. And so they do, and they try to just white knuckle it and just say all the things and tell the whole story. And what happens is they don't feel better. There's like a flood of overwhelming emotions and pain and reliving and feeling naked and exposed, maybe in front of a sponsor or a group or a therapist. And like, why did I just tell them that? And now I don't want to see them again. And actually, I need to go get high stat because that was so overwhelming. So no, and if people are going to do that kind of work, because many people have healed from trauma by processing trauma narrative, becomes really important that somebody has training in how to help people walk through those experiences, that safe coping skills are solidly in place, that there's a gentle approach. Creating change is past focus, but it has a lot of extra safeguards in terms of how to help it be as safe as possible, especially for people who struggle with addiction. But we also know people are able to recover by focusing just on the present. Seeking Safety has over 60 outcome studies done on it with really good results and high client satisfaction. People's symptoms get better. They also like the treatment. And that is a model that does not involve going back and telling the story.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. In step 11, before you get to step 12, helping others, step 11 says, pray only for the knowledge of God's will and the power to carry it out. So I think it's, for me personally, whatever that God means to each individual, that's important for me to do before I get into step 12 and be of service and try to take someone through the steps. It's important to utilize that. So thank you. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share to help our listeners better understand and help cultivate compassion for people suffering from addiction and trauma?
Yeah. Well, I guess, I'll share a Bible verse. You shared one a moment ago, but my favorite verse in the Bible is Psalm 34:8, and it says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and near to those who are crushed." And so I guess what I would just share is just this idea that, we do need to connect with one another with compassion to be able to pull within ourselves, like our own wounds. We're all wounded in some way, whether that's trauma or other, but to pull within that and to be able to view one another, to see some connection through our humanity with one another in a way that we can treat each other with respect and kindness and move away from some of these stigmatizing kinds of ways of talking about people who struggle with trauma, mental illness, addiction, the othering that we talked about today, but to be able to respond to others with empathy and compassion, which really comes from being able to see ourselves through a compassionate lens, to honor the wounds that we have, to face them, to be honest with ourselves, and to express that same kind of love toward ourselves that we want to express towards other, and to know that, God is on your side, that in the midst of even the darkest of times, that he's near. And I think a lot of people experience God as being far, right? That he's against you, that it's punishment. And my personal belief is that in the midst, and I've seen this as a trauma therapist, in the midst of the darkest time, in the midst of the healing, that God shows up and people are able to experience that they were never alone. And so that love, right, that weaves between, what the Bible talks about in terms of, love others as you love yourself. Well, that kind of assumes that you do love yourself. So starting with the love of self, spreading that to other people, knowing that you are loved by God that is not against you. Those would be my parting words.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. I'm going to end it with a quote from Lisa. "Recovery from trauma and addiction has no defined endpoint. A broken arm heals, and that's it. You return to life as it was before. But trauma and addiction recovery transforms you. You're still you, but now incorporating a broader sense of yourself, your place in the world, and your connection to others. It's often described as a tempered steel. Wisdom from suffering has made you stronger and more resilient. This also means that you can inspire healing in others." Summer, thanks for coming on, and thanks for helping others heal.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Boo Boo. I enjoyed meeting with you for the last hour.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Just know we out here. Know we out here working in a major way. Had to speak on it just to make a play. Any given subject, know we make a way. Time to level up on the day-to-day. Know we out here working for the greater good. Expand your mind, broaden your lens the way you should. From the stars to the galaxy to speak on spirituality. Higher understanding for the neighborhood.